Good to go?
Yeah, brother.
Welcome back to the Open Up Podcast, everyone, into episode 61 with strategic advisor and speaker Morgan James Crawford, brother.
Thanks for having me, brother.
Straight off the bat, we've tried to do this before, but the Wi-Fi failed us.
It did.
Can you describe yourself for us as a man, or how you see yourself as a man and as a human?
Yeah. And I love this question when you asked it before, and I've had some time to think on it since then. And I think what it really comes down to for me is as a man, how as an identity of a man, how I'm represented in a world. So what choices do I make and what expectations are there of me to choose or represent as a man? And for me, it comes down to a set of foundational values. So how I'm represented as a man and how I choose to be seen as a man comes down to a set of values that I live my life upon, not only in my personal life and my relationships with my family and in business. So for me, what I'm looking to embody and what I call in my life at the moment is communication and honesty and respect and love. So the idea of what it is to be a man, I think for me in the last couple of years has dramatically shifted from the expectation of what has been role modeled as a man versus coming into what I want to be seen as a man and how I want to be represented in the world.
Cool.
Yeah.
How has that perception changed? What do you view being a man as at the moment?
So going back to being a child or being a teenager, what I saw modeled to me as a man was the provider and the protector. You know, whether that be physical protection or financial protection, or physical providing or financial providing. And although my beliefs haven't shifted for being able to provide those things in my life, I don't feel that as a man it necessarily has to be a role that is provided, and it depends on the relationship. Depends on the relationship of intimacy, family, friendship. And so I've transitioned into a space where, and we're seeing now the empowerment of people all over the globe, especially the female empowerment movement at the moment. And what I noticed for me is sometimes jumping the gun in order to play the role, to be the man, I was actually suppressing a partner's ability or a friend's ability to actually shine and be independent. So now I sit and I rest a little bit more, and I see where I fit in each dynamic, and that's how I choose to represent myself as a man there.
That's really cool, and that's probably the perfect segue into the first story that you're going to share, and that's something that happened in your childhood. Are you okay walking us through that?
Absolutely. So when I was 6 years old, I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, about six and a half, rushed to the hospital with a severe earache at that time, and I remember both my mother and my father at the time trying to soothe the pain that I was feeling, incredible earache in my left ear. And after hours and hours of nurturing, soothing blessings at that time, it just wasn't working. So I was rushed to hospital, and they did a blood sugar test when I arrived there, to just as a general test. And they found out that I had type 1 diabetes. My blood sugar glucose reading was 29. And to create some context for that, the normal person without diabetes sits anywhere between 3 to 5. So I was 500% over the limit, and they said, I think your son has diabetes. And this was a very interesting time in my life, a very tumultuous time as my history and my life experience goes, because my mother, even prior to my birth, had been battling a mental illness of bipolar. And for those that know about bipolar, you can have extremely high euphoric emotions in blissful times, and you can also have very depressive, very pessimistic emotions which are controlled by the biology of the body. So about 6 months after the diagnosis of my diabetes, and not that I feel is any way related, but in terms of going through some very monumental milestones occurring at that time, the diabetes and my mother's death were very closely linked. So 6 months later, to what I believe, my mother getting to a point of not being able to potentially cope or choosing not to deal with this disease anymore in the states of pain that she was in, decided around a month after my 7th birthday to take her own life. And she chose to do that by hanging herself in our shed.
Yeah. So at that point, sorry to move backwards, but
Sure.
after having gone through diabetes, pretty much at that point you get diagnosed, and what that usually means to a kid is that you're different from everyone else.
Yeah.
How had that impacted you from that diagnosis up until that point?
When I look back at that time, I remember spending a lot of time in hospital after the diagnosis with my mother, trying to understand and be taught and educated around this new disease that I was told that I would have for the rest of my life. And so I remember at 6, not fully comprehending the enormity. I just knew that now I had to take insulin through syringes or injections, and I had to have them 3 times a day. And then with a smaller needle, I had to prick my finger 5 times a day to understand when I had to eat and when I had to take these needles. So there are moments that come up in my mind of running away from my mother or running away from my father because I didn't want the needles, and having to be lured back with some type of treat or some type of negotiation that would occur. So in terms of seeing myself as different, later that recognition came, that realization came, but in that moment, it wasn't initially. It was living the life as I was as a kid and being happy and enjoying that, and trying to avert and run away from needle time as much as possible. So it was very much the onus of that diabetes was on my parents. I hadn't taken full responsibility for that yet.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry to take you off on a tangent, but are you comfortable walking through your story from there?
Of course. So on the night of my mother's death, my mother and my father at this point had been separated, and were living at 2 different houses about 1.5 kilometers apart. And so being from a family of 8 kids and 6 under my same mother and father, what would happen was the older kids would go and spend time with my mother, whilst my baby sister and I would spend time with my father. And then when the older kids would come back to my father, my little sister and I would go spend time with my mother. And that was the best way to also manage the illness that she was dealing with as well. Obviously, with the amount of kids that we were, too many people there at one time, especially a 5 and a 6-year-old,
Yep.
is a lot of work. So on the night of my mother's death, my baby sister and I and my father were due to head over to my mother's house. And we arrived at my mother's house, and all the doors were locked. Lights were on, but all the doors were locked. And I remember at that moment not really thinking anything of it. It hadn't registered in any format yet that anything was wrong. And I remember my father walking around the house to the different entry points to see if we could get in, and everything was locked. And we walked around the back of our house, where there's a pool area, and on the other side of the pool is a garage. And back at that time we had storage in there and pool tables, and it was kind of like a common area. It wouldn't be abnormal to spend time in there at night. And my dad noticed that the light was on. And so behind my father, myself, and my baby sister Maddie walked along this path towards where the garage is. And as we got to the edge of the path, my dad asked my sister and I to stop and wait. And this is probably the first time that I'm feeling intuitively, I'm feeling something's not right. I'm questioning why my father has asked us to stop, and why aren't we continuing with him? What's wrong at this point? And so the way that our shed opens up is it's not a slide door. You have to unhinge a hinge from the bottom left-hand corner, and you have to pull it up from the bottom.
Yep.
And I remember my dad kneeling down on his knees and unlocking the hinge and opening the door just enough to put his head under, maybe a foot. And very distinctly in that moment, I remember him shutting that door extremely hard, getting up onto his feet, turning around, grabbing me by the scruff of my shirt here and my sister, and walking very briskly about 10 or 15 meters into the house to place us in the lounge room, asking us to spend time with each other and to not leave this spot, and that he would be back. And I know now, as an adult, I know that my father left at that time, went straight back to the garage, opened up the garage door and tried to resuscitate my mother for, I think, about 25 minutes until the ambulance arrived.
That's a lot to deal with. As a father, man.
Yeah.
It's a heavy burden.
Yeah.
Have you spoken at all with your father about what he went through in those moments?
What I've found is, as I grew up and begun to understand the enormity of that event, as I came into greater emotional intelligence and greater understanding about responsibility and suffering in the world, I began to comprehend that event a lot better than I did when I was 6. You know, at 6 it was very much, why is my mother not here anymore? What happened to her? I know something's wrong, but I don't know why. And as I've become older, I have opened the door to have those conversations with my father by telling him how I felt and what that event meant to me when I was 6 years old, and what that event meant to me when I was 14 years old, 16 years old. And I've noticed that when I've opened the door and communicated that vulnerability, he's always been there to share, always been there to meet me.
Oh, that's powerful.
Yeah.
I guess, I mean, it sort of baffles me because he had that opportunity to just go straight into the garage.
Yeah. What I know now, being 23 years on, and the information that has come to light through that event and that night, was when we arrived at the house, we were about 30 to 45 minutes too late. And although I've never asked my father whether his brain was able to calculate in that moment that it was too late and to remove us, or whether his instinctual automatic response was, I can't allow my children to see their mother like this.
Yeah.
And how that will impact them.
Yeah. Either way, that's a stoic and brave response.
Yeah.
Unselfish.
Yeah.
I guess looking back now, all the work you've done, you obviously have a better understanding of what happened, and I guess what sort of beliefs and traits you picked up along the road since that moment.
Yeah.
You, your sister, as well as your dad.
Yeah.
Have any of you ever spoken about any guilt that may have come from that? Because I can imagine your dad would have felt guilty until he got the report saying that it was too late anyway.
Yeah.
I can imagine as a kid you'd feel guilt, knowing that, especially looking back as an adult, knowing that your dad took you away instead of going in to try immediately.
It's a very interesting situation, because as a kid, and and I know this from my personal experience, you never consciously recognize that you're holding guilt, or at least I didn't. I didn't realize initially that over time my mind would concoct a story that felt some type of responsibility for that event. And although logically sitting down with an adult at that time, or sitting down with a psychologist, or sitting down with anybody looking at that situation logically would go, there was no way in which a 6-year-old could have contributed or be responsible for that event. That choice was made by my mother, by an adult in pain. But yet, as I grew up, I questioned, was the influence of my diabetes and the added stress of that condition a contributing factor? Could I have done something more or said something more? What didn't I say to my mother, or what interactions did I not have knowing what I know now? Which is silly in a sense, because you can't know in hindsight, but that doesn't stop the mind replaying that event over and over and over.
Yeah. All right. So talking about the process for you as someone working through guilt, purely because I feel like this process of healing, especially guilt that you don't deserve to hold, will resonate with most people listening to this.
Yeah. This is the process that I found 26 years on has occurred from the moment of the event. So being very young at the time, the first stage of awareness around this particular event was what happened. What really happened? At what level can I comprehend what happened? From there, it moved to building greater connection with a mother and a woman that I never got the chance to do past being 6 and 7. From that stage, it began an internal process of how did the absence of my mother affect the way that I'm living life. And one personality trait that I learnt very early on was, as a young kid at primary school and high school, there was a lot of awareness that my mother had died, and yet what had happened and how it had happened was held inside the family unit. So I wasn't ready to openly and vulnerably talk about what had happened to the public, because I didn't even know yet.
Wow.
I didn't even know emotionally how I felt about it. I hadn't landed on that yet. So over time, I developed this trait of being able to avert and reflect through white lies or simply eversion in my speaking. And it was one of the first times, in part a positive and a negative. The positive was it's one of the reasons that I'm able to speak articulately today, because I had to think constantly on my feet of how to avert the real emotion that I was feeling at that time. How do I articulate moving what is being asked to what I'm comfortable talking about and what I'm not? And so it was great to develop that gift, but at the same time, it also took me away from authenticity. If I didn't want to approach something that was authentic, whether it was a feeling to me or not, I had a mechanism to be able to deflect it.
Yeah.
And that really impacted my personal life, that really impacted my business life, because over time it took me further and further away from me as a way to deflect who I was versus who I thought I needed to be, which is the next process.
Yeah. And if that's a habit that you've picked up, that you get good at, that makes you feel safe, you're just going to keep compounding upon it and getting better and better until it becomes something destructive.
Yeah. And that's exactly what I did. It got to a point where, although I was feeling very strong emotions as a teenager, I wasn't at the emotional or mental capacity yet to really get an insight and process still that event. I had narratives running constantly around, yes, I've done the work, or yes, I'm okay about that, or I still get this tickle in my throat if somebody brings up that subject.
Yeah.
And what happened is as I went from 16 and 17 and I started becoming an adult at 18 or a legal adult,
Yeah.
I built this entire profile, this entire mask in front of who I was. And the way that I chose to do that was in the form of success. You know, I hadn't accepted me yet. So how on earth was the world going to accept me yet? So I'm going to give the world what I think they want. You know, the world is about, at that time to me, the world was about success, picket fence success, which was being at the top of your A game in a job, making great money, having a car, a house. And so I went after that. I went after that because it was a way of not having to face off with myself, and it was a way of being accepted by the world whilst I wasn't comfortable being me.
Man. With you learning how to, I don't know if manipulate's probably not the best word, but manipulate the conversation to only share what you're comfortable with.
Yeah.
Did you ever feel comfortable? Did you ever have those conversations within your family unit? I know you said when you asked your father, he'd open the door for you.
Yeah.
And he'd speak to you on that level.
Yeah.
Were you able to comfortably talk about that within your family?
Yes. Yeah. That was a great disparity of my life at that time. I had an inner circle which saw Morgan as me, as the true authentic version of me, who was vulnerable, who was scared, who was joyously a little kid, who just lived. And that was my family and my partners at that time. And the polarity in my life was, and this would always cause conflict, is when I was outside of that circle, I'd be a complete different person. Completely. And common comments and feedback that I received for people in my inner circle was, you're a completely different person when you're around these environments. If people only knew you as I know you, or as we know you.
How, for someone who's used to having the conversation deviate to where they want it to go, how do you take feedback like that? Because in that situation, if you had a little bit of mindfulness, maybe you would have been able to register, holy shit, I am being someone I'm not. And then that might sink in. But being in a state where you feel like you need to portray yourself as something you're not to gain acceptance, how do you take that sort of feedback?
Yeah. Initially, I couldn't even see it. Initially, the narrative for me was, well, you see me as this person because you've known me my entire life, and the person that I'm acting on the outside is the person I'm becoming. Yes, I might be different around these scenario of people or friends, but that's just me becoming a new person. I'm growing up. I'm in this disparity of subconsciously averting what I'm not able to accept, but at the same time running a narrative that I'm just growing into a new person. And so my mind narrative completely protecting me from the real truth. And so I lived in that for a long time. Because it was, what does the mind do massively when it's in ego? What does it do greatly? Is nobody knows me like I know me. And so that was the easy way of saying, well, I hear your feedback, but am I taking it seriously? And a lot of the time I didn't, even from the people I trusted, because I went back to, what do I feel? I went back to relying on me. And I couldn't quite see it the way that they saw it, and I don't think I was ready to.
Yeah, and I think that's probably another good segue into the next story, which I'm assuming leads to like the breakthrough.
Yeah. I was traveling the world At 17, I was at high school. And I was at a high school called Eastern Hills, up in the hills of Helena Valley. And at that time, there was a discussion around the end of year 10 at 15 to take me from Eastern Hills to a private school called Helena College, around 5 or 6 kilometres away. And the influence of that at the time was not a large amount of my brothers and sisters older than me had gone to university or completed university. Mm-hmm. And my father, having grown up after my mother died, very, very close to him, almost closer than some of the other children, because when my mother passed away, he was responsible for my diabetes when I was at an age that I hadn't taken responsibility for it yet.
Yeah.
So we had to bond, and we bonded very closely. And so in year 10, my father had the idea of sending me to a private school for a better education, to go to university, because it was the process to get into a good job, to start a career, his way of providing a track to success, to support me in areas of life when he couldn't support me anymore.
Yeah.
And my girlfriend at the time was at the new school.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So reflecting back on how much my choice was academic and how much my choice was relationship, one might be a little bit heavier than the other. But I was happy to go nonetheless. And I'd gone from classes of 35 kids per class, which in a lot of the classes, the teacher spent more time controlling the testosterone and things flying around the class than actually teaching the curriculum, to a school with a maximum of 7 students in each classroom.
Wow.
And laptops and very structured working. And for me, I loved that. But it provided, within the first 6 months, it provided a massive polarity that I wasn't up to scratch. There was a recognition there. These kids were smarter than me. These kids knew how to study more. And for the first time, for a guy that I suppose would talk about himself as maybe one of the popular kids in school, didn't feel that way at the new school. I may have been friends through the association of my partner and had friends, but it was more of the disparity of I felt stupid. I felt really stupid.
Yeah, and I guess for most people, the easiest way to deal with feeling stupid is to pretend that you don't care.
Yeah.
How did you deal with that?
For me, it actually triggered something from when I was in primary school. And when I was in year 4 or 5, my English and math skills were so bad that I had to have a consistent tutor for a year, because my baby sister Madison, who was a year younger than me, was actually more literate with her maths and her English than I was.
Yeah.
And I was really struggling. So for me, the recognition of being in year 11 and facing off with that again just reinforced I was stupid. A stupid kid. And maybe academic education is not for me.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm not smart enough to go and be a lawyer, or maybe I'm not smart enough to pursue the dreams that I have that I was told from a kid that I could do. This is the first time I started to believe that I couldn't.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And then how do you go from that point to someone who does chase that success? I mean, having your confidence dented that much, most people would just submit and give up that dream.
One experience that was always running in polarity or parallel to academia was always out of the system creative processes.
Yeah.
So an example of that is when I was 12 years old, I wanted to have more pocket money to like go to the store and buy things and hang out with my mates. And obviously from a family of 6 kids, pocket money spread pretty thin.
Yeah.
And So I came up with this great idea to just do odd jobs around the house. You know, I'm in year 6 and 7 at this time. So being from the hills, there's lots of gardening to be done. There's lots of raking to be done, things like that. You've got to clear fire breaks before summer every year. And you can imagine the amount of properties in the hills that have fire breaks.
Yep.
So I went on the computer and I thought, I'd been doing these jobs around the house for my pocket money anyway. So what's the difference between doing it at my house and someone else's house? So I created up these little flyers with the old school tabs where you'd have the numbers on the bottom and you could rip the number off, and it was Morgan James MJ's gardening service. And what we would do is for $10 an hour, we would go to somebody's house and whether they needed washing done or raking done, we'd go to their house and do that. And I did this for about 6 months. And my dad would let me use the tools we had at our house, or I could use the tools if they had tools to support them in whatever they were doing. And after a while, I was like, "This is good. I've got more money. You know, I'm learning. I'm learning at 7 that this is how the way the world works. I can buy a new mountain bike if I save up for another 3 months based on how much I'm earning and how many jobs I'm doing. So the mechanism of understanding trade in the world is starting to happen, and." I have a couple of friends hit me up and they were like, "Oh, what are you doing? You always seem to have, you're buying cheesies at the canteen." I was the primary school dude that had had more pocket money. And yet everybody knew in the neighborhood that we weren't a poor family, but we also weren't a rich one. And so I was like, "Hey, I actually have people ringing me from all around the neighborhood to do work, and there's only one of me. Do you guys want to work with me?" And they were like, "How much are we going to make?" And I was like, "Well, you guys will make like $8 an hour. And like, if you're happy with that." And they were happy with that. So I changed the pricing structure from $10 an hour to $12 an hour. And then on big jobs where they'd do a whole fire break, 2 of my friends would go out. So we'd be charging $12 an hour each, and I'd be paying them $8, and I'd be making $4 off each of them an hour.
Just sounding like Gary Vee right now. I love it.
And I thought this was the most amazing thing in the world. This was my foray, not knowing at the time, into running a business. It was like, these guys are working, they're getting paid, they're happy, and I'm also getting $8 an hour, and I'm like at home. Like playing on my bike or kicking the football, and I had to advertise, and I had to organize, and I had to run the payment. And for those facilities, I was still making money. And so I did that for like 12 or 18 months when I was really young, from primary school to early high school, which actually allowed me to have kind of money to do things I didn't have to ask my father for, who wouldn't have it at the time anyways. And so segueing back to year 11 and 12, when I was questioning whether academia was for me, I didn't jump to immediately an option of, well, if it's this, it's nothing. What I started to feel was, maybe the system of academia is not for me. Maybe the way that my mind thinks, maybe the way that I choose to operate in the world isn't as clear-cut as professions that require intensive training in order to facilitate that service. Maybe my skill set, maybe my gift is the ability of taking my creativity, my creative nature, like with the business at 13, and turning it into something, finding a gap in the market and introducing it, or innovating a product. And around the same time that this was happening and converging in my life, my partner and I, Kelly, at the time, we broke up. So there were huge life forces pushing me away from that route.
Okay.
I was being told by advisors that my grades weren't cutting it. I was having the thought that maybe academia is not for me. If you've ever broken up with a girlfriend in high school, it's the end of the world. Yep. Independence Day just occurred.
Oh man, I remember crying in my bed.
Absolutely. And it's horrible because it's the talk of the school. And you're trying to deal with how you feel about it and how being around them is every day in every single class, because you're inseparable when you were together. And And so about 2 or 3 months into year 12, along for the ride, because my dad was paying money he didn't have to send me to a private school that was 5 times more expensive than the government school. Feeling guilt, like I'm going along for the ride, I'm going to barely pass if I put all my might and effort into passing this test. My older brother, Hayden, 21 at the time, 4 years older than me. I'm at his house one night and he's asking me about high school, and we have a really strong relationship, really close relationship. And he tells me, I've got something really exciting to tell you. And I've decided to go travel the world for 12 months. I'm going to go up north to Port Hedland, and I'm going to go and work, and I'm going to save the money, and we're going to go and pay for 46 flights around the world. We're going to stay in hostels. We're going to travel all over the world for 12 months. Do you want to come? I'm facing down the barrel of already being pushed, already feeling like I don't want to be there.
Yeah.
And the idea of being 17 and traveling the world, it's too good to pass up. Like that lit a fire in my soul. The idea of being able to travel the world and experience things I'd seen, on the internet, or from a boy that was in the hills, which going to the city and coming to the beach was a big day. Do you know what I mean? From that pocket to the world. And I said, absolutely. How are we going to get this by Dad? How are we going to get Dad to agree to this? Because you remember, his train of thought was, send my son to a private school, give him a great education, and put him in the best possible position to get a degree and go into the workforce. How was I about to now tell my father I was about to demolish that plan at 17? Not having the life experience he had at 55, 57 at that time.
Yeah.
At that point, he knows far more about the world than I do. And what I find really interesting about that situation, with a bit of help from my brother Hayden and my brother Ryan and a couple of my sisters, was he actually let me. But this is the thing he said to me. He said, if you make this decision, you take full responsibility for how this impacts your life. From this point forward, I will take no further responsibility in how your life is shaped. You are completely responsible for your life.
That's a profound and scary statement for a 17-year-old.
Yes, it is. And there's a part of me that digested the brevity of that in part at 17. And then a part of me much later in life as an adult who really understood the brevity of that statement. But initially was, sweet, I can go. And this is what I said back to him in return, and I always find this funny. It's not the equivalent of the Jim Carrey story where you've seen the story about Jim Carrey where he talks about coming to LA as an actor, and he writes on that check for services rendered $10 million, and a week before he dated that check, in the future he received $10 million for Dumb and Dumber.
Yep.
I said to my father, I said, Dad, and this is falling back on my creative nature, things that I'd done in business at 13, the charity events I'd ran at 15 and 16. I said, Dad, by the time my friends finish university, I'll be a millionaire. Very tongue-in-cheek. As a tongue-in-cheek and egoic at the time as a 17-year-old. But at the same time, and knowing what I know now about my life, having the hindsight to look back at how my life has played out, I think there was some part of me that had more confidence and knowing in my ability to be creative and work outside of the system than the system was going to give me.
Yeah.
Because you can only do so well in something based on how you are in relationship with that thing. And I wasn't in relationship with academia. I wasn't in relationship with university. Not to say it doesn't have its place, but it didn't have a place for me. And I'm not sure how much you want me to go into the next couple of years leading up, but we end up leaving on that trip and going on that holiday. And my brother, in the very first place that we arrived, Santiago, Chile, we check into the hostel. My brother falls in love with the manager of the hostel, cancels his entire trip, and says, "I think I love her. I'm staying." And I remember this conversation distinctly, drinking, in Spanish what we call papa fritas and cerveza, beer and chips.
Yeah.
And I remember saying, if you love her, there's nothing more important than love. Like 18-year-old kid, hopeless romantic, there's nothing more important than love. If you love her, you can travel later. I said, but I'm not staying. I'm going. Don't tell Dad. And for the next 6 months, I continued forth on this trip, traveling on my own. I just turned 18, around the world in hostels, meeting people, and that, which I very rarely talk about, was one of the most expansive, eye-opening, confidence-building experiences of my entire life. It's one of the foundations that my life as an adult right now builds upon. The perspective of the cultures that I got to immerse in, the independence I had to form, traveling and orchestrating, going through countries I'd never been to before on my own as an 18-year-old boy from the hills.
Man, I can't even imagine what that would have done for you, because, I mean, I would have popped up a camper van and travelled WA, and that's probably been the most eye-opening experience I've had in my life to date. Taught me a lot about life, a lot about myself, a lot about the habits and traits that I have, and most importantly, about the accumulation of shit. So I can't even imagine what you went through at 18 and travelling the world, man. Yeah. That's epic.
Yeah. It's one of the things that if I'm ever talking about in my life what I've been through or what I've experienced, or in some cases what I've achieved, it's the one thing that I very rarely talk about but I hold dearest to my heart. Is that opportunity. That opportunity changed my entire life. It was my university degree.
Yeah. Wow. I guess especially for someone who can articulate well, going to different countries, you learn to connect with different people from different cultures.
Yes.
Who have different ways of communicating. So, in a sense, you sort of built that communication skill in travelling the world, which is amazing.
Yeah. It decompartmentalized for me my national identity. Up until that point, I was teenager, Morgan, footy, Australian, all fine things, amazing things, very connected in with our country identity, our national identity. But in some forms, in some countries where you don't speak the language, and I'm speaking Oka Australian as it was to people in Brazil and people in Santiago, Chile and Spain, and often the mode of communication is eyes and gestures. And I didn't realize this at the time. I've done a lot of work around communication and relationships now. What I didn't realize at the time was when you have to communicate with other human beings, no matter what creed, no matter what country, when you're communicating through gestures and eyes, the level of intimacy that was sometimes communicated was beyond my ability to articulate any language. If I could take the chip and matrix download every language into my mind, it would not have achieved the level of intimacy that I achieved in some conversations, simply just looking and moving. And it was really special. From the very surface, being a young guy, single, over there trying to dance and have conversations with girls and not being able to communicate, that's a whole new environment you've got to learn to play in. How do I express that I want to dance? How do I express that, I'm enjoying our interaction? Or I need to go to the toilet, or like so many scenarios play out. And this one comes to mind where I went with my brother to meet his new partner's parents, the hostel manager. Head over heels in love. I was coming back from different places of the world back to Chile to spend time with him, and then I'd go off again.
Yep.
And I remember going out and meeting them for the first time, and they spoke not a word of English, not a word of Spanish. Both of us, Hayden and I.
Wow.
Hayden's now proficient in Spanish.
Okay.
But at the time, he's 21, I've just turned 18. We end up bonding for 6.5 hours over a game of dominoes and red wine. To the point of humans just being humans. Like, we were just bonding over fun. And that was enough. And that's probably the first time that I realized that the way to achieve intimacy in relationship is not necessarily through articulation, it's through emotion. But we're taught to believe that articulation creates emotion. And yet, if you've ever done the staring exercise, or you've ever really bonded with somebody through gestures or eye movements, you realize that emotion can be evoked quite strongly without speaking.
Yep. 100%. Most people cry.
Yeah, I remember I did first time. I bawled my eyes out. It was confronting and beautiful. Yeah.
That's cool, man. That's epic. I guess looking back now, what would be your biggest takeaway from that journey? Mm-hmm. Having to do that all by yourself, learning to communicate just with your eyes and with gestures.
Yeah. What I took away from that journey, the largest remembrance I took away from that journey is just before I'd left, I was coming to this recognition that I was seeing my older brother Ryan in business at the time, and I was seeing my father in business, and I was seeing a lot of automation in the world, a lot of automation. And automation at that time for me represented efficiency. I couldn't understand why people would not do things efficiently if there was an opportunity to do it that way. And when I spent a lot of time in different cultures and countries, I noticed people spending 2.5 to 3 hours for lunch, or watering their garden instead of using a timed reticulation system. And I questioned this over and over. Why are you wasting so much time? And it wasn't until later, coming back from that trip, that I realized only when I came into connection with myself in a way and to a level that took me years did I realize that part of the human experience, part of us being here on this earth, is the levels of depth in relationship we create. And that's not just between you and I and human beings, it's the level of depth in relationship to a plant and a garden, or a creative project and a business, or a gift.
Yeah.
And so it really solidified that experience really solidified for me the importance that more mature cultures that have existed in the world longer than Australia and our society, what they have come to learn. And I felt like that was part of my education.
That's awesome, man.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is the practice of mindfulness, whether they're mindful of it or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just appreciating what they're doing, the action that they're taking.
Yeah. What you have in the now, and accepting it's enough. Yeah, and not going into often the suffering that can be created by wanting to be in or achieve something beyond where you are right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the only other thing I wanted to touch on from that was that relinquishing of the identity of being Australian, because obviously being a Kiwi and Aussie, there's a lot of the banter, especially working FIFO like I did.
Of course.
It's like the Aussie versus Kiwi.
Yeah.
And I'm the typical scaffolder bro, so I got more banter than most.
Yeah.
And what I've obviously with a lot of self-work, a lot of introspection, I've come to like relinquish being this Kiwi guy, like everything New Zealand, All Blacks, Kiwis Rugby League, everything, I'll die for it.
Yeah.
I've relinquished that and realised that the more we segregate or separate ourselves with those identities, the nationalities, using them to separate ourselves, like we become more and more distant, and we only put up barriers that aren't even really there. Like we're tying ourselves to sports people and teams and notions because we see them as successful, we see them as positive. And if we stop trying to associate ourselves with that identity to feel that way or feel some type of way, then we can pull back and start working on ourselves. So that's what I've started doing with that identity, and it sounds like that's what you had to do in relinquishing being Aussie, and succumbing to the fact that being Aussie doesn't mean shit when you're in those other countries.
Yeah, 100%. And coming from someone who spent 10 years playing AFL as a little kid, AFL, cricket, basketball, soccer, you name it, you know, we played it. And so healthy competitivism existed in the family, for sure. You know, my older brother, Hayden, who was 10 times better than me at every sport, no matter how well I played. You know, what I came to realize was that there's nothing that's bad or wrong when it comes to loving a team and loving a sport and rallying behind a community. You know, that feeling like when you go to a football game or probably like a rugby game and your team's on that gripping moment of like a point and just how you feel, that's amazing. That's part of the human experience. Where I began to notice I wanted to change was when my belief or attachment to a community or a thing started creating conflict with others.
Yeah, and especially I can see that now, especially with this revolution that the Indigenous Aboriginals are going through here, that attachment to being Australian, and especially a white Australian, not trying to, I guess, be racist or put anyone down at all, but that attachment to identity is largely based on superiority. And
there's what can be quite hard for the modern societies to manage, like us living in society now, is we are combating heaviness and wrongdoings of a time we didn't live in. That have been passed on to us through conditioning and mentality. And so now you've got generations of all factions around the world separating themselves from conflicts they weren't even involved in. That's not to lessen the brevity of that conflict. But do we choose to continue holding on to something that separates us? And this is, I think, the fine line or the knife's edge that a lot of mediators or a lot of groups that are trying to work through unity really come up against is, how do we move forward from here while showing respect that the event and acknowledgement that the event occurred? Because you can't continually bring an event, and this goes from the scale of mass, white, black, factions, political, all the way down to relationships of between a man and a woman, or any type of relationship, and a man and a woman and a woman. If you're going to continually bring something from the past into the future, you will continually experience that past through events and people. And so there is no separation, and we're getting a little bit esoteric here.
That's all right.
But there's no separation between those events you see out there, between political parties and between races and countries, and the own conflicts that you find in your family dynamic, in your relationship. They're just exacerbated versions with more humans but we all run off the same foundation. So, not healing them and fixing them, but sometimes the answers and the solutions to amicably resolving and respecting solutions. Mm-hmm. Often it's not only about a party that has to provide acknowledgement and change, but it's also the victimized party having to confront that once that change is offered, are we now willing to let go of the old to move into the new?
Absolutely, man. Because, like you said, whether it's a relationship or whether it's like the Indigenous movement at the moment, if someone offers you a helping hand, if someone gives you that hand to help you up, and you see that person as, I guess, superior, and you've detested that for as long as you can remember, the only way we're going to break down any of those barriers, or resolve any of those issues, is by people both sides having the self-awareness to understand who they are and how they're impacting someone, as well as being empathetic enough to understand what the other person's going through. Yeah. Because on the one side, if you're the victim and you can't understand what that other person is going through, who you deem as the person or the culture that's hurt you, then you're never going to be able to forgive. Yeah. And same as if you're superior, or the culture or the race that's done the wrongdoing in the past, if you can't understand how that person's hurting by feeling like a victim their entire lives, then you're never going to give them the space to heal.
Yeah. And a couple of things come up on that is really kind of key takeaway statements that have always really resonated with me. Hurt people.
Yeah.
And one of the big challenges to change is facing off with yourself, not the perceived wrongdoing, which kind of tags into the third, which really resonates me. It comes from a very high-level psychologist that I cannot remember the name of right now, but the statement is, you can only ever control your choice. You have the free will to choose an action, a word, a statement. But when that leaves you and it is then received by another, you have no control over that. Now, some people I know through personal experience would look at that and say, so you're completely removing responsibility of what you chose? Not at all. You are 100% responsible for what you chose. But you cannot control how that's going to be perceived by everybody else. Now, you can go as sliding scale as controversial topics as you want, and all the way back to mediocre topics. But if the analogy of that is, I'm going to say something to Lockie about his nationality.
Yep.
And I'm going to say something that is going to trigger, whether it's up there on the surface or down there below, something that questions the status quo of that nationality. You have a choice when I say that, and you always do. Yes, you may be, like most of us, welling up with emotion and ready to act, ready to respond like that, or ready to react, which is what most of us do. But you still have a choice as to how you handle my choice.
Yeah. Okay. Gonna make this a two-part. Obviously, you've got more to the story, but
sure.
In terms of what you've been through up until this point in your story, what we've covered, having gone through diabetes, the loss of your mum, travelled the world, broken up with your girlfriend, and everything between, what have you used or implemented in your life to help you come through some of those struggles?
Mm-hmm. Being honest, at those times, I don't really feel like I had tools.
Okay.
But what I do feel is that those adversities, those struggles, actually provided them to me. And my strong belief is that we don't learn when things are going well. We learn from conflict.
Yeah.
We learn from adversity, and something about adversity that creates self-introspection, and the self-introspection and the learning that comes from self-introspection creates the tools. Now I know how to process heartbreak. Now I know how to deal with despair when things aren't going right in my life. Like when everything with school seemed like it was crashing down. Now I know how to seize opportunity creatively.
Yeah.
And those things I didn't know at the time. Those things I was just reacting in a moment. But over time, introspecting about those things and seeing what choices were made and seeing reactions that occur and what played out provided a tool belt, because they were not going to be the last times that I experienced heartbreak or a loss or things breaking down all around me. They were the training wheels for the next set of those experiences that were about to come.
Yeah. That's exactly it, man. And I can relate to that, because last year I ended up having a breakdown, trying to understand why I did what I did, why I was such a cheater, why I cheated on all my girlfriends all the time, why I needed to feel fulfilled by chasing multiple different women at the same time.
Yeah.
And it's only through going back through all of that and understanding, like you said, with that self-introspection, why I took that action. It got me back to an event as a kid where I realised that actually spawned a belief that made me do that stuff, or didn't make me, but compelled me to do that stuff to feel like I was enough.
100%.
So without that adversity, I'd more than likely be someone who still, or without having reflected on that adversity, I'd still be someone who cheated on his partner.
Yeah.
So I can understand that, and I've been through that recently. So,
and it's taking what always seems like at the time the worst thing in the world, and it's very easy to play out, why is this happening to me? Yet only in the moments of recognition of why, those moments of joy where the penny drops, why the experience played out the way it did, you switch from suffering to gratitude.
Yeah.
Gratitude to gratefulness. And then from there, you stop seeing things that don't go your way as problems and opportunities to play with your tool belt. For sure, you don't become impermanent to human experience. You get smashed, but you get that little bit better at getting back up. And that's the whole point. Right there.
Yeah. And I guess a lot of those instances, especially for me, it's been a life of constant worry, stress, anxiety, because I've done a lot of wrong without being caught for it. So it was literally a life of anxiety about being caught.
Yeah.
And in acknowledging where that belief or where that pattern of action or behaviour had come from, I was able to work through it and leave that in the past and move on as a new version of me who doesn't have to worry about being called out, doesn't have to worry about being this fraud amongst people who thinks he's good.
Yeah.
And that's fucking liberating.
Yeah, man. And were you able to, at that moment when you moved on, able to respect the process that had occurred enough to forgive yourself from carrying guilt into the new moment?
That is a different process. No, that one took about 6 months.
Yeah. And that's quick. That's a good, yeah, you must have been working hard.
Yes.
It can be a process.
A lot of self-hatred.
Yes.
Yeah, but finally at a point where I'm comfortable with who I am now.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I'm going to ask you a few wrap-up questions before we wrap up part one. Knowing everything that you've been through up until this point, what would you say the quality of your life is like now?
The quality of my life at the point in the story that I'm up to, or the quality of my life right here in this moment?
Right now, because I'm not too sure when we're going to do part two, and it may change between now and then.
Yes. Right now, my life is fantastic. Absolutely amazing. There are things in it that I could look at and say, that's not how I want it.
Yeah.
But that's the old way of how I relate to life. I don't look at life now and think about where I want it to be and the gap between where I am and where I want it to be and live in suffering. I'm in a process right now where I'm good here. It doesn't matter how much money I have or how little money I have. It doesn't matter the people that aren't resonating with me and don't resonate with this or like me and the people that do. It's where I'm at right now is enough, and I'm okay that I'm enough.
It's fucking powerful, man. It's a beautiful statement.
And that dramatically impacts me feeling peace, less stress, because all of those events can occur right now, but majority of stress created in my particular life was the consistent worrying about wanting to be someone or something else other than what I am right now. And for the first time in my life, I'm completely fulfilled by who I am right now.
Fuck yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I'm happy for you.
Thank you.
Truly.
Thank you, brother.
What have you added to your life or removed from it to improve the quality of it?
You know how they say that people and your environment influence you?
Yeah.
And often in the past, I'd taken that as judgmental. Oh, these people aren't good influences on me, so they need to go. And these things aren't good influences on me, so they need to go. But then I came to the recognition that I was projecting that other people and other things were responsible for my choices.
Yeah.
Right? Which, as we've talked about, that's me not taking responsibility. That's me not living in me. So I found a way to work within that, but is where I take responsibility. So in terms of removing or adding, what I'm choosing in the moment now is I have a set of life values that in the last 12 months I've decided to commit to really nut down who it is I am at my core. Not only to understand the gaps in how I've acted versus who I am at my core, but how to embody that outwardly now. How do I embody who I am at my core? Be completely who I am. So in terms of adding and removing people, environments and things, what I do now is I invite people in, or I choose to spend time in environments that reaffirm those values for me.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's a more not only self-aware, but empathetic way to go about it, instead of the common notion of just cut negative and toxic people out.
Yeah, 100%.
What are you most grateful for right now?
Come back to the now for me, largely through a meditation practice, is like this whole conversation, this 90 minutes that we've been speaking, the body has been regulating breath. Like 1 trillion cells in our body have been regenerating every 3 seconds for the last 90 minutes. Like that in itself, like beyond achieving and being and making money and doing something in the world, just the fact that we are here right now without any entitlement of our deservingness to be here. Just the fact we're here, experiencing what it is to feel cold and hot, to taste things, to have conversations. That for me right now is my world. I am fulfilled by that. I require nothing else than that. I love choosing experiences to have, and that's the difference. I'll still be out there and I'll do things, but I don't need it. Yep. I'm choosing it. That's what I'm grateful for, man. Life, in a huge way.
That is so dope.
Thank you, brother.
That's probably the best answer I've had to that. Fucking set a fire right in this chest, man.
Yeah.
Last question.
Sure.
If you had the chance to put a message on a billboard where you know thousands of people would see it every day, what would that message be?
This is an epic question. What would I put on a billboard that I'd want everybody to see? Live for you. Yeah, live for you, because the notion of being selfless, I've learned in my life, actually comes from being so full within yourself. You have an ability to give without condition. And so to remind people that when they choose jobs and relationships and actions around friends in social circles, to choose for them. Sometimes it's not the PC thing, sometimes it's not the socially accepted thing or the popular thing. But if you are a human being who's really choosing for you, your ability to give to those in need is profound. Unconditionally. And you don't need to give in order to be whole, because you already are.
Yeah.
So you simply just choose to give because you can.
Damn.
Yeah.
Dropping bombs, man.
Thanks, brother.
Love it. To wrap up, man, I just want to acknowledge you first of all for making time. You don't live in Perth anymore, so you've made time, you found us a space to do this.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that, really appreciate the effort and the thought. Appreciate you as a man and as a friend as well, but most importantly I appreciate the message that you're bringing to the world, and you stepping into your power now, advising and speaking, sharing this message, sharing the information that you have.
Yeah.
I feel like it's been a long time coming, hearing about you going through that journey, traveling the world and learning how to articulate, learning how to communicate with people of all nationalities and culture.
Yeah.
I feel like this moment's been waiting for you, and I'm super proud of you as a friend, and super grateful as a man and as a human living on this planet for you to step into that power and share this message.
Thank you, brother. That really does mean a lot. And let me reciprocate by saying, when we first met and we talked about, you asked me, am I speaking? Am I delivering a message? Am I in this space? And I told you not yet. There was a huge event and process and switch that needed to occur in order for this message, my message, to be delivered authentically and with humility. And I wasn't quite there yet. And I want to express my gratitude and my love to you, because when that switch was flicked, the bond that we have as brothers, as men, talking about how we're seen in the world as men, what was important to bring this message out initially, to validate for me, to verify for me this message, was the container of a strong masculine who's done the work to be able to sit here and go, I'm going to hold you in this vulnerability, something that's going to be put out publicly, something that a lot of people are going to see. Someone who's done the work to hold a loving space, to respect and understand that story and being able to flow with me like we have. There's no one else that I can think of who would have been perfect to do this interview.
Thank you, man.
So, yeah, man, as much love as you have for me and respect you have for me, it's reciprocated and it's right back at you. So, thank you.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Welcome, brother.
Cool. I'll just do into this.
Yeah.
Guys, like we talked about, there's a lot of talk about reflection, introspection, and of course to do that you need self-awareness. If you aren't currently self-aware or self-aware enough to change where you are, this position in your life, your circumstances or any issues that you're facing, take the opportunity to cultivate some mindfulness with our 4-day mini course. I'll drop that in the link below. What we do is we habit stack 4 habits, one on top of the other. And really what we're doing is we're setting you up for the morning so that you kickstart your morning the right way with a little bit of mindfulness that will hopefully, that will definitely positively impact the way that you interact with the world, the way you interact with the people that you love, but most importantly, the way that you interact with yourself. And of course, how you start your day is how you end your day. So start it with this 4-day morning mindfulness mini course that's free. We've got a couple of free tracks that I've made personally for you guys, an affirmation track and a meditation track with Theta Wave binaural beats. So cop that down with the download link below. Other than that, I love you guys. Ciao.
Yeah. That's fast, bro.